All right. If somebody else shows up or if there's a comment that I don't see, please draw my attention to it so I can make sure that they get into the study. All right. So we are beginning on Proverbs 2. I posted some questions on the Common Sense Bible Studies and things for people to think about before tonight.
I wish I'd seen them before tonight, but anyway, I didn't look and see them.
Here we go. All right. So, well, let me just go over these questions real quick, and then we'll read the text of Proverbs 2, and then go back and see what thoughts anybody has about these questions, what answers anybody's come up with. So in Proverbs 2, what process does the text prescribe for learning the fear and knowledge of God? And are there steps in the process or is it just general direction? Number 2, the chapter begins by describing how to obtain wisdom from the proper source and then discusses 3 primary benefits of wisdom. What are those 3 benefits and what verses address each one? Now, that one's kind of a tricky one because everybody's going to read this chapter a little bit differently and probably put an emphasis on different benefits because there's a long list. And the way that I read it, they're kind of grouped in 3 areas, but there's a lot of overlap too. Number 3, how does the Bible define the concepts of righteousness, justice, and equity? And number 4, Solomon's advice was directed explicitly at young men. So he talked about avoiding the ways of evil men and avoiding adulteresses. However, the principles apply to young women as well. So how would these passages be worded differently if they had been addressed to Solomon's daughter instead of his son? Presuming, of course, that the text is written by Solomon to Rehoboam or one of his other sons rather than from David to Solomon or something like that. Okay, so Proverbs 2. My son, let me switch over to ESV. I was on King James Version there. My son, if you receive my words and treasure up my commandments within you, making your ear attentive to wisdom and inclining your heart to understanding. Yes, if you call out for insight and raise your voice for understanding, if you seek it like silver and search for it as for hidden treasures, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom, from his mouth come knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright. He is a shield to those who walk in integrity, guarding the paths of justice and watching over the way of his saints. Then you will understand righteousness and justice and equity, every good path. For wisdom will come into your heart and knowledge will be pleasant to your soul. Discretion will watch over you. Understanding will guard you, delivering you from the way of evil, from men of perverted speech, who forsake the paths of uprightness to walk in the ways of darkness, who rejoice in doing evil and delight in the perverseness of evil, men whose paths are crooked and who are devious in their ways. So you will be delivered from the forbidden woman, from the adulteress with her smooth words, who forsakes the companion of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God. For how her house sinks down to death and her paths to the departed. None who go to her come back, nor do they regain the paths of life. So you will walk in the way of the good and keep to the paths of the righteous. For the upright will inhabit the land, and those with integrity will remain in it. But the wicked will be cut off from the land, and the treacherous will be rooted out of it. Did anybody have a chance to consider these 4 questions and kind of think about them as you were reading?
Well, I did write some thoughts down before I read your questions when I read it earlier this week. So I felt like verses 1 through 6 were kind of stating that keeping the Torah is not just tick boxing. It's something that you do with your heart. It's a heart matter, and that Yahweh will give you better understanding of the Torah as you walk it out, as you live it. And so you learn to treasure it more. Because it says that if you call out for insight and raise your voice of understanding, if you seek it like silver, that he'll give it to you, type thing. So that was my thoughts on 1 through 6.
myself, just like I'm sure all of you guys do, I write in the borders of the Bible, and I have wisdom, not necessarily equals, but I guess, yeah, wisdom equals the fear of Yah equals knowledge, and then it goes to understanding. And I think when I do my prayers, I think I'd say, Father, please give me wisdom, knowledge, and understanding, because I think that's kind of the pattern of how it goes. I also have written here, and I'm assuming that I was reading Job and looking at Job 28:28 remind me of Proverbs. Now, if I remember right, you can correct me if I'm wrong, anybody, but I think Job is considered like the oldest book in the Bible, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm assuming that Solomon was reading Job at some point. And as I was reading Job, who knows when, it's my favorite book, but I have my battles with it. And Job 28:28 says, and he said to man, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to turn away from evil is understanding. So I'm sure that, Solomon read that many times, and he just grabbed from that and then expanded it to the rest of Proverbs. So that's wisdom. Wisdom is the fear of Yah. And, we gain understanding when we understand that his instructions are there for, blessings. And if we don't do them, then they're there for curses. And once we understand that, then, that's when we kind of get the whole package.
Yeah, Job is kind of a funny book, and the story is certainly older than all of the other writings in the Bible. But apparently the Hebrew reads as if someone from like the 6th or 7th century was writing in an older style. So I suspect, and I think that, a lot of more conservative scholars believe that Job was an oral tradition that was then written down later. But Solomon definitely would have been aware of it. All right. So the common thread seems to be that the gaining of wisdom is a progressive kind of thing. That God doesn't just zap you with a lightning bolt and all of a sudden you're wise as Solomon. That's not even what happened with Solomon. It was a long process of, searching out and walking out the wisdom that he had learned in order to learn more wisdom. And I think that all wisdom is kind of in a continuum or a spectrum. There's no complete wise man, nobody out there who has total wisdom, and nobody who is a total unadulterated fool. Everybody has some kind of wisdom and some kind of foolishness still in them to be worked out. And it is a process of working it out. Lots of trial and error along the way. These first few verses, I think it's verses 1 through 8 that are kind of a block. I mean, it's really 1 through 4, and then 5 and 6 and 7 and 8. I think those are all kind of blocked together. But 1 through 8 is a kind of an entire thought, and it kind of describes this process, the progression of somebody who is willing to learn wisdom to somebody who has learned wisdom. And it begins with in verse 1, where the person, whoever Solomon is talking about here, he is listening. Let me pull up my scriptures, my Bible, so I can see it. It says, "If my son, if you receive my words." So that's really just reception. The son is willing to hear what father has to say. And then he says, treasure up my commandments or my instructions within you. So he begins with just being willing to listen, and then he's actually internalizing what has been told to him. So it's an active reception. And then in verse 2, making your ear attentive. So that's like not just hearing, but really paying attention, really trying to understand what's being told to you, inclining your heart to understanding. So not just trying to understand the words, but to really understand the intent and implant it inside of you, to internalize it. And then in verse 3, it goes to, if you call out for insight, it's like the son has been demonstrated a willingness to hear. And then he's really trying to hear it and understand it. And then increasing, like, this sound, this flowed so much better in my head. Each one of these steps is, I think, more intensive, from passive listening to an active listening, a deliberate internalization of the commandments or the instructions, then making your ear attentive to wisdom. So not just hearing what is being said, but listening to what's behind being said, or looking for more things to hear rather than just what's being offered. And then inclining your heart to understanding. This is really trying to understand all of the sources of wisdom that are coming to you. And then in verse 3, calling out for insight, it's like asking for more, not just passively receiving anymore, but asking for more knowledge, more understanding. And then in the next part of verse 3, raise your voice for understanding. So first you kind of ask, and then it's like, no, more. And then in verse 4, you seek it like silver. And the Hebrew word for seek here, let me switch over to my concordance, bakash. And this is the same word used generally when somebody is just keeping an eye out for something. Like when Jacob sent Joseph out to find his brothers in the field, when Joseph is walking along the road, and this is the word that's used to describe what he's doing. He knows generally where the brothers are. He's not hunting for them. He's just walking along, looking around, like, I know they're around here somewhere. So it's an active search, but it's not intensive. And then finally, at the end of verse 4, search for it as for hidden treasure. And the word here for search is like turning over every stone, not going to rest until I find it. So the son has gone from being willing to hear to actively hearing, and then to internalizing, asking for more, demanding more, looking for more sources of wisdom along the road, until finally he is actively searching and hunting it down. And only after this does he then get understanding of the fear of Yahweh and find knowledge of God. This phrase, knowledge of God, is a little curious. I mean, in context, it's pretty clear what it means. Kind of. Is it knowledge of God, or is it God's knowledge? Like knowledge that belongs to God? And it's sort of both. It is knowledge that is given by God. Just like you will never get true wisdom on your own. You can't go on a mountaintop and look inside of yourself to find wisdom. This only comes from God. But wisdom only comes from having a knowledge of God. And since God is incomprehensible, he is infinite, there is no way that you can really understand God unless he reveals himself. So it is both knowledge of God and knowledge of God, if that makes sense. There are 4 main ingredients of wisdom, or participants, if you will. You and God are the participants, really. And then hearing and action. And these are all described in this first part of Proverbs 2, where the student is the one hearing, he's being receptive to it. But what he hears isn't just what his father is telling him. It has to be the wisdom of God relayed through his father. And then after you have heard the instructions, internalized it, diligently sought out understanding, only then do you begin to understand the fear of Yahweh and find knowledge of God. And of course, it's knowledge of God that begets a fear of God. If you don't understand him, you won't fear him. And if you do understand him, of course, you will fear him. And once you have that understanding and knowledge, you finally get wisdom. Because as we, from chapter 1, I think it's 1:7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. It doesn't say the beginning of wisdom. It says the beginning of knowledge. So when you begin finally to understand God, then you begin to fear him. And when you fear him, you respect him, and you will pay more attention to what he's saying, because to not listen to God is dangerous. Everything he says is important. And then when you finally hear God's voice and put his instructions into practice, like what Randy was saying, that's when you finally learn wisdom, by putting that knowledge into practice. And wisdom, I don't know if you saw that quote that I had on the first thing. Wisdom is the righteous application of true knowledge. I don't know if you're familiar with Vadi Bakum. He's a Christian pastor, Calvinist. So, I mean, I don't agree with everything he says, but he is a really good teacher and he's got a lot of great things to say. And I thought he put this really well, that you can gain all the knowledge in the world, but if you don't put it into practice, you'll never really learn wisdom. And it has to be true knowledge that comes from God, because you can learn all about the natural world and still never really attain true wisdom, because it's all interpreted through your own reasoning, through your own mind, which is flawed. One of those questions was, this chapter gives a process for learning wisdom, and we just talked about that. And then it gives 3 benefits for, what do you get out of learning wisdom? What is the point? And, God doesn't give us knowledge or wisdom just to be kept to ourselves. There's a purpose for it. Everything that God gives us, he gives for us to use. And wisdom is no exception. So here's how I kind of divided up the chapter. In verses 9 to 15, it's talking about how gaining understanding, which is essentially the same as wisdom, understanding of God's creation and of God and how we relate to each other. Understanding keeps you from the ways of evil men specifically. In verses 16 through 19, it talks about how understanding will help you avoid and resist temptation. And in this case, it's specifically talking about the temptation of the adulteress. And finally, in verses 20 to 22, it says that an understanding will lead you to doing good and living according to righteousness, which then gives you more prosperity, more security in the land. But the security and the prosperity aren't the main purpose. The purpose of the wisdom is to live more righteously, to do good, as opposed to doing evil or giving into other people's evil. So let's take a look at some of these specific verses here. In, 9 to 15. What are righteousness, justice, and equity in verse 9? Then you will understand righteousness and justice and equity, every good path. Did anybody have a chance to look up some of these words and figure out what they mean in a biblical context?
The ISR reads, then you would understand righteousness and right rulings and straightness, every good path. So that kind of explains it a little bit more. Straightness, which, right rulings, which are also Yahweh's laws.
Right. Yeah. All through scripture, the concept of justice is tied to God's instructions. There is no justice outside of the commandments that God gave. And so I think the Hebrew word here might actually be mishpatim. Let me check. Verse 9, judgment. Yes, mishpatim or mishpat for singular, which are judgments. These are when you evaluate a circumstance in light of God's law, you judge it right or wrong. Here's how you behave in this situation. Here's what you shouldn't do. That's what justice means. It doesn't mean what the world thinks of as justice. I mean, obviously there's going to be some overlap because we are, we're all God's creatures and we have at least a basis of understanding of God's law inside of us at some level. And righteousness is again centered on obedience to God's commandments. Righteousness is the obedience to the commandments. Justice is the determination of what is right and wrong in any given circumstance in the light of God's commandments. And finally, equity. Hebrew is evenness. So, straightness is a reasonable translation. I think it doesn't really get to the point of what it's trying to say. A lot of times when people talk about equity, they mean making everything the same. so that if Joe puts in a bunch of effort or he's smarter and able to get better grades, and somebody else maybe works hard but isn't as smart, so doesn't get as good of grades, well, equity means they would both get the same grade at the end. That's not what's happening here. Equity in this case, this is all in the context of God's commandments. So equity is the equal application of God's law. A rich person or a famous or well-known person or a well-liked person doesn't get any kind of favoritism in God's law. Everybody pays the same census tax. Everybody brings the same sacrifice, with a few exceptions like the king or a high priest, something like that. Everybody has the same requirements for witnesses against them. Everybody has the chance to defend themselves. Everybody has the right to a public trial in the location or in their community, unless the community can't figure out the justice or the mishpatim in this case. Heidi, you got your hand up?
I do. Isn't that fun that I get to raise my hand in class?
You're lucky I saw that, though. Kind of hard to see that tiny little hand.
Well, I didn't want to interrupt you. What I think is interesting is that the flow from righteousness to judgment to equity is that the righteousness is sort of the what to do, the doing of what is right. I think of it, the word zadak, which is like a zadaka, or zadakim, which is in Hebrew is a righteous man or righteous men. But then justice is that legal application, right? So you have righteous men doing governance type behaviors, but instead of it being according to every man in his own eyes, then it has to be with that equity, which, as you said, with Torah, God's commands being that's the even ground. That's the straight line that everything else gets measured up against. I just thought it was an interesting linguistic flow of one to the other in the meanings of those words.
Yeah, it is. And I'm sure that it was laid out that way on purpose for that very reason. You obey the commandments, and then you're able to apply them, and then you are able to be the judge. As you learn more wisdom, you can also progress from one role to the next. First, you're simply somebody who obeys it. Then you're somebody who is able to understand the law and maybe be an advisor or one of the witnesses at a trial. And then finally, you are the one who is able to make the determination and apply the law and make rulings. I mean, technically, I think the mishpatim really means rulings. So the concept may be a little bit fuzzy in English. I don't know. But yeah, I think that's a good observation. Verse 10, wisdom will come into your heart and knowledge will be pleasant to your soul. Wisdom will come into your heart. What does that say to anybody? I mean, what's the difference between what it talked about earlier, inclining your heart to understanding? What is the difference between that, deliberate internalization and this later concept in verse 10 of wisdom will come into your heart?
I put down to love discipline.
Like the knowledge will be pleasant to your soul. Yeah, I think that loving discipline, and knowledge will be pleasant to your soul. I think that's really a side effect of the wisdom coming into your heart. I think the real difference between these two ideas is that the first one is you working at it. You're the one who is inclining your heart to wisdom up in verse 2, or you're inclining your heart to understanding. But then in verse 10, wisdom will come into your heart. This is something that is happening to you rather than something you are doing yourself. So this is God working in you, the Holy Spirit working to build wisdom in your life. And the result of that is that knowledge becomes pleasant to your soul, that you learn to love discipline. And then you find yourself in the place where David was writing Psalm 119, and how he could say over and over and over again how much he loves God's law and still not get tired of it.
And will it be wrong to replace wisdom with, instead of like right there when it says for wisdom will come into your heart, can you say for the fear of the Lord will come into your heart? and knowledge will be pleasant to your soul. Can you replace one for the other? Would that be accurate to do, or is
I
that a
don't
stretch?
think so. I think that the fear of the Lord is something that comes before wisdom. That you can't really have wisdom until you have a fear of the Lord. But the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge about God. You know, when Proverbs 1:7 says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, what it really means is that it's the beginning of divine knowledge or an understanding of God. But that's the very first step. Even a little child should be able to think about a God who is able to create the entire universe just by speaking, and think, and, you know, have that pang of fear. Like, I don't ever want to upset that God, because if he can just say something and I pop into existence, what happens if he's upset with me? Can he say something and I pop out of existence? I mean, that's not the way that God works, but he has that power. He can if he wants to, but you can't really understand or begin to understand God until you get past that threshold. You know, people are always trying to make God in their own image when it's really the other way around. And, you know, they squeeze God into this box and they say things like, you know, I can't believe in a God who would do this or do that. Like, well, God exists whether you believe in him or not. So your beliefs are irrelevant. What you need to wrap your head around is that God does these things and he's got a good reason that you don't understand and you probably never will. So just accept that he's bigger and better than you are. And then once you get past that, then you can really understand God, and your heart will be more open for him to put wisdom into it.
Right. Well, I think that one of the things that the way I try to understand my relationship with God, and I think this is kind of easier if you've had a good relationship with your earthly father, is that I think if you say, you know, fear of the Lord, and you hear it, it has like bad connotations to people that don't have understanding, right? They're like, oh, you know, fear God. Like, I thought God was love and all this other bumper sticker stuff, right?
Yeah.
But in reality, it's like, I think about, you know, my dad, since I've had a pretty good relationship with him all my life. And, you know, he's a quiet man. He doesn't talk too much. But, you know, when I was a kid, I truly did fear and love the man at the same time. You know, I feared him because I didn't want his punishment upon me, you know, not following his instructions, you know. But, you know, with time and building relationships with him, right, I understood that, you know, that fear that he put upon me through his words, instructions, or, you know, other acts, in reality it was because he loved me, right? So now when I see him, you know, there's still fear, I guess, to an extent, but it's not, obviously, you know, I'm older now and stuff like that, but there's still that, there's not that fear has turned into love, because I know that he did all those things because he loved me. So when I think about my relationship with God, I think about my relationship with a good earthly father. And I think that in today's environment, it's really hard for people to understand that concept, because, you know, there's so many, you know, single parents out there. They don't understand what that's like, you know.
Yeah, especially fatherless homes. And that is a huge problem for people in their relationship with God. In a lot of cases, the state or the school or something like that kind of takes over that place of the father, and they do a terrible job of it, because a father should be right there with you. And when you're a little child and, you know, your father is big and strong and even scary to an extent, but you know that he loves you. And so that even though he could hurt you, he doesn't. He's gentle. Maybe you're familiar with the concept of dad voice. It's kind of something jokingly. I don't know if other people use that term or not, but Paula used it jokingly. Sometimes when I had to correct my son, if he wasn't paying attention, I had to switch over to dad voice. And, you know, I can talk normally, and all of a sudden it's like I've got a bullhorn and you could see him jump and the tears would start welling, but he wouldn't run away from me. If anything, he would run towards me, because he knows that the whole point of the dad voice isn't to harm him or make him terrified. It's to get his attention, to bring him back to me so that he will listen to what I have to say to him. And my dad had the same thing. And I don't know if I learned it from him. I don't know where I picked that up, if that's just a common thing that all dads do. But it is it was kind of a joke around here. My son has moved out, so we're kind of empty nesters now.
Well, I was just kind of looking over that verse, and, I feel like I'm on a theme tonight, and I might not get off of it, but so many times in Hebrew, when they talk about things holistically, we're very linear in our Greek Western mentality. Every A goes to B goes to C. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times Eastern thought is much more circular. But wisdom, being, I heard the definition for wisdom once of being the capacity to know the right thing to do. So it's having good judgment, right? It's, we've turned it into this esoteric idea that tends to become so mystical that nobody can really know what's right, which, obviously deals with the elimination of absolutes and stuff. But if you know what is right, if that knowledge of what is right comes into your heart, then the word knowledge is yada, which is like aha, kind of like that. But it also implies it's an experiential knowledge. It is something that you have seen and felt and touched, and that is pleasant to your soul or your nefesh or your breath, or often your soul is considered the seat of your emotions. And so knowing what is right and experiencing what is right, doing what is right, will make your soul happy. And that is absolutely true, because that I know that more often because of the other side, that when I don't do the right thing and I experience the consequences, it doesn't feel good. Yeah. So, anyway, that was all I had for that.
Yeah. Well, I think the rest of this chapter bears that out pretty well. The second part, the verses 9 through 15, where it's talking about understanding will keep you from the ways of the wicked or the ways of evil men. One of the benefits of that is that, see if I can find the right verse. Understanding will guard you. Men whose paths are crooked and who are devious in their ways. Yeah, it doesn't really make it explicit there, but what happens to people who are crooked in their paths and devious in their ways? Eventually they run afoul of the law, and then it's back to the judgment and equity. They're going to be judged by the law that they ignored. And then in the next part where it's talking about the adulteress, it says, for her house sinks down to death and her paths to the departed. In one sense, that's literally true, because the penalty for adultery is death in God's law. But it's also true that her house sinks down to death because her behavior will sabotage her own house. She can destroy her relationships, eventually destroy her own security, even if her husband doesn't want to prosecute her and, have her stoned to death. It's still going to destroy her relationship, and she will lose her security because of it. And in the last part, she will walk in the way of the good and keep the paths of the righteous, for the upright will inhabit the land, and those with integrity will remain in it. It's not 100% certain thing that if you live according to God's commandments, you will live a long and happy, prosperous life. That's not really the way that it works. But you will live a longer and happier and more prosperous life. There was a teaching I was listening to earlier today, and I'm not really familiar with the teacher, so I'm not going to give his name right now because I can't really verify that he's a great guy, but I thought he put this really well. People who live by their feelings have wonderful days and horrible lives, while people who live by wisdom have hard days and wonderful lives. That is the benefit of incorporating wisdom and God's standards of behavior into your life, is that it will make your choices harder. It will make things more difficult for you. It's always harder to win by following the rules than by cheating. But in the end, the end result will be more positive. You'll get to pass go more often. Discretion will watch over you. I'm not going to go through every single verse and every word in here because we just don't have time. But I think there are some phrases and things that kind of stand out and might be more interesting to talk about. Some of this might be obvious, but might not be obvious to everybody. So what is this phrase, discretion will watch over you? What does that mean? It's pretty much the same in every translation too.
Isn't discretion, wouldn't that be the same thing as just being cautious?
Usually, yeah, like making sure you look before you leap.
Right.
Yeah. The Septuagint has it as good counsel will guard you. But again, that's kind of the same thing. Whereas discretion, we usually think of it as my own personal good sense. Whereas good counsel is the good sense of other people. But those are both aspects. I mean, those are both ways that we can gain some discretion on a situation. Understanding will guard you, delivering you from the way of evil, from men of perverted speech. Perverted speech, what do you think that means?
Any type of speech that is tries to lead you away from the right rulings in the Torah of Yahweh.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable.
Perversion means this also comes to think, another synonym to this, to twist, right?
Right.
So it's to twist, the word of Yah, I guess, assuming the word of Yah to something else that it's not. Because I think that, we see that in, I think we've all experienced that at some point where you hear, especially now that we know better, you hear, so-called teachers, and you hear the way they twist the word. And when you twist the word, that leads to perversion. And back to, now we're in grace, now we live in grace now, and people take that grace for granted and just, go out and do, more liberal things, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Perversions of the truth. Like, yeah, teachers who will
twist it, but take it out of context.
Yeah. And they know what the truth is. They can read it, but either they don't understand it because they don't believe all of God's word, or their consciences are seared because they have kept making choices contrary to what they knew was right, and so they can no longer tell, or because they are deliberately trying to deceive people. Those are all true. But everybody at some level knows what's right, and it takes, just as it takes practice learning wisdom, it takes practice to really become perverse too. I mean, it's much more natural. We're much better at it. It comes easier. But we all have a conscience, and you can't keep telling lies and keep, distorting the truth while you still have a conscience, because eventually it hurts you. But if you do keep doing it, eventually you deaden that conscience so that you can't hear it anymore. This next verse, from men of perverted speech who forsake the paths of uprightness. The implication is that they know where the paths are, and they are refusing to take them. Either they were on them once and departed from them, or they can see it and they are simply refusing to walk it. We all have that opportunity to see where the path is and take it. The people who rejoice in doing evil and delight in the perverseness of evil, we see that all the time. I think this men whose paths are crooked and who are devious in their ways, I think that gets to the same idea as the perversity of speech and thought. All right, so then we get into the forbidden woman, or this strange woman, I think is what King James calls it, the strange woman. And really what that means is that the woman who is not in your house, the woman who is in somebody else's house. And since this was explicitly addressed to young men, it's easy to see why this would be a major concern. This is always a concern. I mean, people haven't changed that much. I've heard a lot of stories over the last couple of years of men who appeared to be men of God who fell into one compromising situation or another, whether because they sought it out or because they simply were weak at an inopportune moment or opportune moment, depending on whose perspective.
Well, when I read also about the adulterous woman, it makes me think of also come out of her, my people, Babylon, the adulterous woman that's mentioned in Revelation. So it could actually be not only an actual adulterous woman, but a stronger or deeper level would be if we dabble in false religions. I'm trying to use my words kind of here because I don't know where everybody is, but
right.
It's just kind of like, well, come out of her and from the false religions, the religions of the world and stuff like that. That's called an adulterous woman.
Yeah, I think that's a really good thought. This follow-up part here, from the adulteress with her smooth words, that could be thought of as, the ear-tickling teachings.
Right.
The teachings that we love to hear, but aren't necessarily true. In that case, it's really the same as the men of perverse speech. It's the same problem, just what is the aim of the perverse speech? In one case, it may be to tempt you into doing something wrong. And in the other case, it may be flattering, something that you want to hear that seduces you away.
So for me as a woman, I'm not going to be running to an adulterous woman on the physical level, but in the spiritual or other areas, I don't need to be listening, like you're saying, to tickling ears, false doctrine, stuff like that.
Right.
That is how I get away from the adulterous woman. That's just my thought.
Good. Thank you.
Brian and I had an interesting conversation about this today. The soft seduction of the adulterous woman. It's very rarely it's, hey, you, let's have adultery. It's a lot more subtle than that. But that when it talks about the perverse man and the evil and the crooked paths, these are all very strong statements. Whereas when it talks about the adulterous woman, it's, obviously the nature of seduction. And that in a very real way, we're talking about that being seduced by heresies, not knowing Torah, not knowing the word. And so, something that sounds almost right becomes very true to you if you don't know the difference. But then on the other side of it, that the perverse man is sort of like relying on governments or men's leadership to define the way you live. So one is the spiritual aspect of it, and then the other is the practical, how do we live each day, and governments and who do you vote for, and seeing so many people get so wildly polarized in those situations and led astray by that. Recently we've seen some of that happen, and to me that was just a really putting it in that context where, yes, we're definitely speaking to specific personal moral issues and choices on a daily basis, but also kind of broader in a societal aspect of it. I thought it was interesting.
Yeah, it is. Thank you. Another example of the adulterous woman in, applying that to spiritual things is that there are lots of ideas out there that may not in themselves seem like they are sinful or, perverse, but they are distractions, things that seem like really attractive. Like, I'd really like to know more about that. And maybe this one Bible verse that maybe it really means this other thing. And I'm going to be all about that, because I think the real secret to understanding God is in this different interpretation of this one verse. And so then you start building up walls between yourself and other believers because other people refuse to see this. And now you've got this almost like secret knowledge, this thing that you understand and nobody else does. And this is a really seductive thing to the human psyche. We all want to feel special. We all want to feel like we know something that other people don't. Actually, further up at the beginning of this chapter, where it talked about the knowledge of God, one of the possible interpretations of that phrase, God's knowledge, like the knowledge that God has, a Gnostic could look at that and say, see, here's validation for my idea that there is a secret knowledge that God lets us in on. You know, when we pass these barriers, when we get past this door and we're in the inner circle, then God lets us in on these, you know, super secret stuff. And now we're extra special. And God likes us more than other people because he's told us these things and kept it from other people. And the really seductive thing about this kind of idea is that at some level, it's kind of true. You know, this whole thing that we've been talking about is God revealing wisdom to those people who are seeking. Because you have accepted the things that God has said and you believe them and you put them into practice in your life, God reveals more of himself and more wisdom about how to live. But these things aren't secret. They're out there for everybody to access. And it's not like God will reveal mystical things about himself and the secrets of the universe. I don't know if you've heard of like the Akashic records, one of these occultic ideas that people with a psychic connection to the universe can wave their hands in the air and pull all these threads out of the air and, you know, tell your fortune by listening to the universe. Well, it's all, I don't know what they're listening to, but it's certainly not the universe and it's not God. But that's where these kinds of seductive ideas lead to. And so it's important that if you have an interesting interpretation of a scripture, that you then seek counsel. Don't throw out all of the scholarship and all of the knowledge that's out there in the rest of the body of Messiah. Ask for people's opinion and take it seriously. Weigh that against the rest of scripture to make sure that it really does fit with what God has revealed in the written word and that it doesn't go contrary to what is plainly written, because the plain meaning of the text is always primary. These interesting and esoteric readings, possible interpretations, maybe they're true, maybe they're not, but they're always secondary. It's the plain reading that should be primary. And hope I didn't go too far afield there. Did that make sense?
Yeah, Jay, I was going to say that something I see that confirms what you're saying about the potential pitfall and resulting pride or arrogance about having a deeper knowledge or a greater knowledge is really addressed right at the very beginning. You actually just scrolled up from it. Let me see if I can get back to it. It's just the very first words are, first of all, my son, which I think kind of shows us our position in the relationship where the source of knowledge is that we are under him. But then it says, if thou receivest my words, to me, that denotes a humility that we have. And I think that's where all of this starts, is just with an attitude of humility. And it's only through that we can avoid that pitfall of being exalted in our own hearts because of what we know.
Yeah, that is good.
Yeah. And back to what you were saying about if you're not sure of something good, like ask somebody, but obviously make sure you know who you're asking all these things for, right?
Yeah, that is important.
When I first started, and you guys have heard me say this before, is that I didn't want commentary from anybody because I didn't trust anybody, because I didn't know anybody, right? I've been lied to my whole, time, right? So I read the scriptures twice in a row on my own. And then I went back and then I started looking at, see if my understanding was correct. But just like you said, Jay, like whatever that person said, I always went back to the scriptures and make sure that that was correct. But, you have these levels, right? There's some societies have, you move up to this level and we'll give you a little more wisdom. And like, they're the ones giving you the wisdom and not God. And like you said, is free there. And verse 3, I mean, it says, yes, if you call out for insight and raise your voice for understanding, well, to me, that sounds like you're praying for it, right? Like praying for it. So who do you pray for? God. So you don't need men. In reality, you don't need man. If you're humbled, like Brian said, and you're pure heart, and you come to him like that, I feel like very confident that there shouldn't be men between you and Yeshua, right? Like he's the one between you and Yah, and that's all you need. But the reality is we're humans, and that's why we belong to a community, so we can have other leaders and teachers and elders kind of tell us, hey, you kind of going off the wrong straight and narrow path. You need to veer back to it, But all you need is really it's you and God.
Yeah, well, I agree to an extent. If you think of somebody like Abraham, he didn't have any scriptures to consult, and he didn't have any. Well, he may have had some teachers. He may have known Seth, and there may have been godly men at some point in his life, but most of the world were idolaters. Abraham was pretty unique. So he had that special relationship where he could speak to God, man to man, so to speak. But it takes a long time to get to that kind of relationship with God. And most people will never be there, no matter how devout or faithful they are. But we do have the scriptures. And one thing that I hear people say is like, why doesn't God speak to me? Like, well, he's been speaking to you for thousands of years. Why aren't you listening? But part of the problem there is that unless you have access to the original manuscripts and can read them, everything that God said is being filtered through men, because it's impossible to translate something from one language to another without inserting your own beliefs and interpretations into it. No matter how objective you try to be, there are always some judgment calls that have to be made when translating. And I think you can mediate that by consulting multiple translations. Never trust a single translation. Compare and contrast. Find the interpretation or the translation that seems to fit with the overall message of scripture, that doesn't contradict the rest. And that fits with the character of God as you come to know it. And of course, the more time you spend with God, the more time you spend in the scriptures and in putting God's instructions into practice, the more you are going to understand God's character, which goes back to this verse 5. Then you will understand the fear of Yahweh and find the knowledge of God. That's really talking about understanding God's character. When you understand God's character, then the translators who are behind the specific translation you're reading become less and less important. And it really does become more about you and God instead of the people who are in between. Those people are never mediators. I want to make sure that that's clear. They are mediating a message, but they are not mediating the relationship.
I agree.
One thing that I gleaned from Proverbs 2, Brian touched on it and Carlos mentioned it, was from the prophet, where we are to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly, which then led me to the apostolic scriptures, ask, seek, and knock. So if we ask for and do justice, and if we seek for and give mercy, and we can humbly walk in.
That reminds me of James chapter 1, verses 5 through 8. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach. All right, and it will be given him, but let him ask in faith with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. This is really about the relationship that you have with God and how intent you are on it. And I think it really reflects back on those first 4 verses and how this search, the quest for wisdom, has to be intentional, and it's an active process. It's not a passive thing. And if you are passive about it, just accepting things as they come and never moving beyond that stage of just being a passive listener, well, you're going to be listening to things from who knows what sources, you're never going to get to that point where you are crying out for wisdom and God is, where your heart is ready for it. I think that, this is one of those things where so many Christians who maybe they don't believe that they're supposed to be keeping God's law. So many of them end up keeping most of God's law anyways, because they are sincere. They are very devout in wanting to please God and wanting to do what God wants them to do. And so they spend time in prayer, in reading the scriptures and seeking God's wisdom. And God ends up leading them back to his instructions, even though they've been taught that they're supposed to ignore those things. God honors that intent and that deliberate searching and trying to learn wisdom, as long as you're humble enough to receive it.
There is actually a kind of a promise in this that Yahweh says that he will guard our paths, and which is comforting, again, taking care of his children. And, if you just, for wisdom would enter your heart and knowledge be pleasant to your being, and that he'll watch over you. Oh, I guess that's in verse 8. His loving, committed ones he guards, or guarding the paths of justice and watching over the way of his saints. Right. He watches over us.
Yeah, with the understanding that doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to keep you safe if you're walking in a bad neighborhood at midnight. But it does mean that he will guard your paths in righteousness. So that
he hopes that you use discretion.
Yeah.
That you don't walk down.
That is an important part of wisdom. Yeah, but if you are intent on learning God's instructions and you are actively trying to apply them to your life, then he will lead you into more and more obedience. And I think that's what it means by he's going to guard your paths. As long as you're listening to what he's saying and not what you are saying. It is really easy to read our own preconceptions into the scriptures and get out of it what we want to get out of it instead of what's actually there.
Hey, Jade, do you have any thoughts about the verses 18 and 19, where it describes consequences about the strange woman's house, and obviously going there, but it seems to be communicating that there's no opportunity for repentance or turning from that, and maybe that has to do with the fact that it says that my version says inclineth unto death, and her paths are unto the dead. So I just thought that was kind of interesting that it actually seems to be a severe final consequence to that.
Yeah, I think this also goes, pretty sure it's James, where he talks about that there's a sin that leads to death.
Right.
And I think he's talking about these sins that God has given the death penalty for, and adultery is one of them. So, I mean, literally messing with a married woman or a woman, committing adultery could literally lead to death. And once it gets to that point, you can repent from it, but you're still guilty. There is still a penalty. So that even if you stop that activity, that doesn't mean you're not going to be stoned.
Right.
It just means that, you throw yourself on God's mercy and God will take care of you in the afterlife. But in the here and now, you're still going to be before the judge. And of course, sometimes, still talking about adultery literally, sometimes there are other consequences, beside legal ones. There can be physical consequences that will lead to death, whether that's in disease or broken relationships. They're just a cascade of trouble that can be caused by infidelity like that.
I think that's
your comment just confused me. Oh, go ahead, Heidi. I'm sorry.
Oh, it's okay, Randy. I was just going to say, I think that's interesting. We seem to have lost a lot of that coming into Torah after most of my life in Pentecostal evangelical circles. the idea of forgiveness and grace was always somewhat married, if you will, to the idea that you could always come back to ground zero.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually not biblically accurate. I mean, spiritually, you can be reconciled to a place of right relationship with God, but the consequences are never just dissolved like they didn't go away. At least the corporeal, the temporal consequences of what happens. You know, if you commit adultery and a marriage is destroyed, a church is destroyed. I've seen that happen. A child is born that now has to live without the rest of their life. You know, all of those things. I mean, there's consequences, there's real life consequences. And since we have, using all these marital terms, we've divorced ourselves from the reality of what is being spoken in texts like this, of what is actually being spoken. There's no coming back from this. This is essentially your emotional, your physical Rubicon. You will always and forever be changed from this moment on when you make that decision. That has been, you know, really sobering. I was telling Brian earlier, talking about this, I said, you know, if you don't guard your heart and realize that you as a human being are never above, I'm never above being tempted to sin before the Lord, whatever that sin might be. And all I know is that it takes that one choice, that one compromise that can lead me astray. It doesn't start astray, it leads you there. And understanding the consequence, understanding that there is none who go to her come back, nor do they regain the paths of life, that could very well be the end result of leaving the ways of righteousness, is a very sobering idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another one very similar to adultery is in murder. If you commit a murder, you kill somebody unjustly, you can repent from that and God can forgive you, but that person is still dead. You have still destroyed their family and everybody who depended on them. And as scripture says, the blood of the innocent cries out to God. There's a spiritual consequence on the land and the entire community because of murder. And the only resolution is the death of the murderer. Sometimes, depending on circumstances, the family or somebody could forgive that person and, absolve them so that they don't suffer the legal penalties. They're not killed in response, but that leaves that taint on the land. It poisons the land so that as the blood of the innocents builds up, eventually the land spews out the people. And that's why God removed the Canaanites from that land and gave it to Israel instead. Not because the Israelites were so deserving, but because the Canaanites had forfeit their right to the land. They had poisoned it against themselves. And I think that's a really sobering thing for America. We have a lot of innocent blood on our hands, and it's not just going to go away. Something has got to break and set those scales back to even keel. I think, Randy, you had a question, or was that Nancy?
I did have a question because I'm kind of confused. While I agree with what you're saying, there is consequences to sin. We are all fallen from the get-go. And yet, if one, let's say they commit adultery or they commit murder, yes, there are consequences. But if you truly are in teshuvah, there is the blood of Yeshua that pays the penalty for that sin. He died for all. Mm-hmm. So I guess I'm not hearing you correctly, because that is the purpose of Yeshua's blood that was shed.
Right. Yeah. His blood can remove the stain of that sin for eternity, so that after you die, you can still be reconciled with God. But up until that point, there is still the justice of mankind, the justice that God has commanded in his law. And, the forgiveness that Yeshua's blood enables doesn't remove the need for that justice.
Right. There is supposed to be a justice for your sin. Yes.
Right.
Or a consequence. Correct. Right. But I just wanted to be sure that I was on the same page.
I think so.
Okay. I mean, I'm not saying that he'll immediately forgive you, no consequences. You can go back, that's the Christianity. Now you can go back out and do it again. I don't believe in that, but that, like you said, at the time of however you believe, when you meet Yeshua, his blood does cover the stain of your sin.
Right.
Yeah, there's always, I've tried to explain this before, and maybe I've done, not a good job of doing before when I sent you guys that podcast, and I was like, well, I think they misunderstood what I was saying. But there's consequences to every action. It's like, you've seen it before where there's, even in, the nation's law where somebody murders somebody and you see that the guy really, or the gal, she was, they feel really bad that they murdered somebody and it was premeditated, they planned to do it. And after it was done, they felt really bad, and you can see it in their tears. And this is after the the judge said, hey, you're going to spend the next 20 years to life in jail, and they look at the victim's family and they're crying and sobbing and feel sorry, and some of them have gone as far as forgiving them, right? So they're forgiven by that person, right? Forgive so you be forgiven. That's great, but that guy still has to spend the rest of his life in jail. Regardless. Now, like we all agree here, I think it's like, yes, Yeshua definitely covers that sin, and in the afterlife and his kingdom, those will not be remembered anymore. But here on earth, there is that, and the reason why is because he's a just Elohim, he's a just God, so he can't go back. He changes not, right? So he can't go back and say, yes, there's punishment for this, but not really. Right. And that's where the misunderstanding it is of the adulterous woman. As far as I understand, she was committing adultery. It's just that, there wasn't two witnesses. Right. So when Yeshua gets on his knees and he did it twice, and he was writing on the ground. I think I did a study on this a while back. I can't remember, but my thought, and one of them is not original to me, but, is that he probably was writing the law down on the ground of that you need, you need two witnesses, and, he was writing something like that. But I think the second one was he was writing about, some famous woman in the scriptures, and I can't remember right now. And maybe was writing down her name as well. So to remind everybody that, hey, listen, you need two, but if they would have brought, I know it's hard to kind of understand, but if there would have been two witnesses there, she would have gotten stoned.
But Carlos, you needed to take her before a judge.
Yeah, there does need to be a full court.
No, absolutely. Right. But
there was two or three things they did wrong. They brought her before Yeshua. There wasn't two or three witnesses, but also Yeshua was not a judge, so he couldn't judge her anyway.
That's right.
They also didn't have the man.
You're right. Yep.
They're supposed to be stoned together.
Right.
Yep. But it goes back to the point we're saying, what does he tell her at the end? You know what I mean? He forgives her, right? And then it goes back to that.
Go and sin no more.
Yeah, exactly. So I think we're on same understanding.